Hello, U.S. History students, U.S. History B students specifically. This is your first upload in this 2-week hiatus. Some of you may have already seen some of the submissions I put on there for debate and then also for world civilizations. And I hope that you can see by the titles, by all means you can look at those uploads, but I would specifically focus for your notes on anything entitled U.S. History B. That'd be the way to go. In this case, the U.S. History B option today is I just wanted to touch on one extra angle. Fifth hour didn't really have as much time as like school and everything was like shutting down and all that stuff on Thursday last week. I wanted to cover one hopeful angle on our first section, The Empire Strikes Back, being on the antebellum period. And before we get into, at least in this part, this section of notes is, as Bethany Gunther has stated, definitely as we talk about the Civil War and some of the angles that were in it and the precipitating factors, this is not a great part of U.S. history. I mean, it's an interesting part. But if you are looking at what it means to be very patriotic and American, yes, Bethany Gunther mentioned before that at times in U.S. history we do maybe right now in a counterculture way overemphasize the bad parts of U.S. history. There's no getting around this. This is, I think, by all intents and purposes, and for all intents and purposes, the most troubling part of U.S. history. I would say that. Even with Japanese internment, which we'll get to, even with civil rights, I think those have some extenuating circumstances that even other countries, the most developed of, Scandinavia is usually an area that can easily judge others because they've had smaller countries and maybe better standards of living, and so it's an easy claim that they can have of like, whoa, what's the U.S. doing? We have all these great things and they struggle. But of everything in U.S. history, I would say this is probably the most troubling. I dare say even in a way, I guess maybe constitutionally speaking, precedent-setting speaking, presidentially speaking for the U.S., this is probably going to be the biggest tarnish on the U.S.'s record. I'd say in many ways more so than the Civil War, relative to other countries, even Western countries that had legalized slavery and all that stuff. We were comparable to them, but this area of a house divided on the brink of civil war is pretty tricky. Okay, so that's the context of what we're going to be doing today and getting into the first part of House Divided. I predict there's going to be 4 parts of a House Divided. Lincoln's famous statement, "A house divided cannot stand," all that stuff. And getting into why that was there within the Civil War, etc. That's our angle. We won't talk directly about Civil War in this section, but we'll talk about like the underlying principles of it and what was happening, just to explain the nuances of it. So that's what this section is. There's probably 4 different parts that you will see on uploaded to YouTube. And for this class, just similar to World Civ, you'll see it uploaded every other day. As was mentioned in the email, as long as you guys send in by Wednesday, March 18th, your song assignment, and I've gotten many of them already via email, then you should be looking good for that. And these notes will be good as we go through each time. You should have the attachment of the notes. I think, shout out to Kaylee Kirkham, she followed up. And I hope if there's anybody that's a disconnect of, wait, the email was sent to my spam, I didn't get it. And I hope you can help others know too of like, hey, did you get the notes? Send me an email and I'll send it directly to you and we'll make that go. So that's what the purposes of these videos is you will have the guided notes in hand and I will instruct you similar to normal class. You're going to be instructed to write down certain parts and you will hand those notes in person on the 31st, which is our scheduled reconvening, or at least the 30th is when you're scheduled to be back here right before spring break. And the test is still scheduled for 3/31, Tuesday, March 31st, before spring break starts. That's the initial and original schedule. We're going to plan on that. If we are still dismissed as of the 30th, you'll get an email explaining what's going to happen from then on. So that's context of what we'll do today. That's context of what we'll do over the next 2 weeks, those 4 different uploads. And then we'll have the test and notes that you will be ready for turning in on the 31st of March. So with that said, happy St. Patrick's Day. I think that it is. I've got my green on, so no pinching. All right, so let's get into it. In the notes of A House Divided, in the first section, well, you see on the front page there's a big block of cheese, there's Trail of Tears, and there's Black Hawk War. Those are the 3 areas we're going to do today. I wish I had a Hunter Spackman or a Talia, somebody to remind me of this, but a lot of times I get to this section on a big block of cheese, and we never mention the cheese, and students are like, what's going on here? So please, in the Nether Sphere, get your good vibes out there, I guess, to remind me, to help you understand why a big block of cheese is relevant to our first section. There is a purpose. All right, so in this section, there's going to be a total of 5 things you're going to write down.
Math and English teachers, please go to the lecture hall.
That's our social distancing. Our departments aren't allowed to be together. And on that note, I hope that everybody's okay, and I hope that you aren't interpreting this as like a crisis or dystopian apocalypse or whatever. Just a sobering and inconvenient time. And I hope that you guys are indeed practicing good social distancing habits as well. Okay, moving on. In the first thing you're going to write down in a big block of cheese, I guess just to say this before, we left off the War of 1812 in 1814 was never actually resolved. There's no treaty signed between them. Britain just gave up. They were too busy with France. They couldn't deal with it. They just gave up. So like we outlasted them again in a way, but a different way. Goliath came in and smashed Baltimore and D.C. My goodness. And I do believe in a non-dark area of U.S. history, that time within the War of 1812, specifically 1814 with Francis Scott Key, was a turning point. I really do. It was a super, super dark time, literally and figuratively, for the U.S. And in the world's history, that usually spelled the disaster of the country. The U.S. had probably been disbanded. Some would have been sold off to Canada or to France or to England. But the fact that they revolted again, escaped those ships off of the coast of Baltimore, and held off and beat back the British until the end of the War of 1812 was a miracle, another miracle. And that's what's encapsulated in the Star-Spangled Banner, bombs bursting in air, proved through the night that the flag was still there, right? Those wonderful lyrics that were a couple stanzas written then, and then turned in eventually by Herbert Hoover into our national anthem. So it did take a while for it to be crystallized as our anthem, but I believe it's rallying cry. And while I won't be able to share that with you, especially Fifth Hour didn't get to really talk about it, I would recommend listening to Whitney Houston's version during the Gulf War, during the Super Bowl performance. Personally, as I've announced many high school sports games and stuff, that's the definitive performance of the Star-Spangled Banner during the war, and also from a very flawed figure. I love that the anthem is not done by perfect saints, and you can sit and you don't need to stand. I mean, that's what makes America great. You have the ability to do that. But I do hope that there is, at least, even for those who are not feeling patriotic, an appreciation of it. But I would recommend doing that, and you can also see the power behind it in a very bright time. Even though like the last verse was omitted of the song because it referenced slavery and African Americans and stuff. Again, we're imperfect, but there's moments that are very powerful, and that was a powerful moment. From First Lady Madison, some of you were mentioning this, I think it was Kyle Kerr, I think. Anyway, we're mentioning there was a lady who ran out with all these items and such from the White House, and she was a symbol of hope. And so as you all flee to your own homes right now, I think you can find a very strong source of empathy for the Americans at the time. It was a very low point. It was a very low point. And I hope you can find empathy in saying, like, those high points will come, even though it's a dark time. And spoiler alert, my most impactful song was actually the Star Spangled Banner. So as I would have shared that with you, I would recommend looking at Whitney Houston's rendition from Super Bowl in the early 90s during the Gulf War. Loved it. I've listened to it so many times, and it still provides a great sense of hope in face of tremendous darkness, which makes our anthem unique. We're not hailing to a queen, we're not hailing to tradition, we're hailing to hope. All right, now with that good stuff out of the way, let's get to the bad stuff. Or interesting stuff. Andrew Jackson. So that first part of Big Block of Cheese is in the election of 1828. Andrew Jackson went up against John Quincy Adams, and Jackson won. So rather short statement, right? That's your first bullet point. Election of 1828, Andrew Jackson went up against John Quincy Adams, and Jackson won. All right, let's break this down. We mentioned this before in the transitions of the parties. We started with no parties, then we had Federalists and Democratic Republicans, and then we had this era of good feelings. From Monroe to John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams won as a Democratic Republican in the previous election, so 1824, I'm doing the math correctly, and he went up against him, and he actually went up against Jackson, because there was only one party. It was the Democratic Republicans. That formed into just the Republican Party at that time, and there was the Northern Republicans and the Southern Republicans. And in a unique time where nobody got a majority of the electoral votes again, this sounds similar to 1800, that means that it went to the House, and because of a couple of House representatives' biases, they went for, in 1824, John Quincy Adams. And then Jackson was put in as a member of his cabinet. And people were like, this isn't fair, and this is a corrupt bargain, and all that stuff. Mainly the supporters of Jackson were saying he should have won, etc. So there was this, like, I'm trying to think of the right analogy here, but it's almost like you have some behemoth. Golden State Warriors, for those of you who are basketball fans. Think of this, I know the NBA season has been suspended, but you go from the dynasty of dynasties to nothing. Obviously, it was injury and stuff like that, but there was division between Draymond Green and Kevin Durant, and like they didn't like each other, and it just like all fell apart like that. Similar to the Democratic Republicans or the Republican Party or the Nationalist Republicans, whatever you want to call it. They were the era of good feelings only winners, and there was no real minority group who could muster enough defense or attacks against this main party. And so knowing that, it was really impressive with how this national party started to break apart. This 1824 election showed that there were some issues, and then in 1828 we see really the rise of John Quincy Adams, who's in like the Republican Whig party now, like the Whigs, a little different from what you think of in like the Tories and the Whigs in Britain. But then you see Andrew Jackson, who comes to the forefront, and he wins of this newly formed Democrat Party, which is really the Democratic Republicans of old, sort of, and the Whigs are like the leftovers. And so he wins. And John Quincy Adams is out. The Whigs are now relegated as like the break-off, so you had like Democratic Republicans going to like basically the Democrats of Andrew Jackson's time, really the father of what we think of as the Democratic Party, to be honest. And you have the Whigs, who then dissolve into nothingness eventually, and sort of come back a little bit, as you'll see with Abraham Lincoln, the Republican Party. So he wins. Okay, so what's the big deal? He wins. Yay, so he gets back. This is different than what we had Jefferson and Adams going against each other. You had Jackson beating Quincy Adams. Okay. Sort of interesting relation with John Adams and John Quincy Adams, but these two go against one another, and Jackson comes out the victor. Now, the second thing you're going to write down, which is going to show his interesting character, is on Inauguration Day, Andrew Jackson invited everyone. Well, that's white. Let's be clear. On Inauguration Day, Jackson invited everyone. In parentheses, you want to put poor, homeless, toothless. Yeah, Yeah, write that down. Poor, homeless, toothless. Jackson invited everyone, poor, homeless, toothless, to party it up at the White House. To party it up at the White House. So he invited everyone to party it up at the White House. That's your second thing you're writing down in this section. Okay, so seeing that as that's who he invited, again, you might think, well, yeah, cool, like Inauguration Day. I see it now. Obama did it, Trump did it. Like, it's your time to do a victory lap and walk around the track with the flag on you and have the Mormon Tabernacle Choir, the Tabernacle Choir at Temple Square, who would sing in the parade or whatever. Like, you'd have all these groups that would support him. That's normal. But here's the third thing you write down. The White House was trashed. The White House was trashed. Holy mackerel. Like, historical records vary in what happened, but he invited everybody who was white, poor, uneducated, toothless, again, drunkards, everybody. Come on in. Democrat Party at this time becomes the party of the people, hence the numeration of the naming of it being the Democrats, democracy, demos, meaning people, the people of party. They come in and in droves. And this is an interesting change. You have people, in some accounts, hanging from more or less not chandeliers, but of ceiling fixtures. You have people urinating on White House, not defecating, but urinating on curtains that you have for windows. And the White House was completely trashed. It was trashed. And what a big bang to come in. So he is known as the people's president in a way, and from inauguration on, and he has a lot of success. So I want to be clear. When I say everyone, we have to be aware of this. The fourth thing you're going to write down is, under Jackson, all white men were allowed to vote. All white men were allowed to vote. Now, we got to be clear here. If you look through and comb through all the amendments, you're going to feel like, Amendment 13.5, that's probably not the right number that you want to use. Amendment 12.5. All white men are allowed to vote. Because the founders, I think correctly, if they wanted to uphold federalism, let the states determine what it would mean in order for you to vote. Now, most states at the time were very unanimous in saying we're going to have white land-holding men vote for most of our nation's history up to this point. The main reason being is they feel like they're invested in it, and if you're not a landholder, you're just some vagrant vagabond whose opinion doesn't matter. And in class, let's be honest, I think we all have a hard time. I have a hard time as a teacher. If we see feedback from students who have not been paying attention, have not been invested, we all take it with a grain of salt, we're not really going to listen to you. That's probably not fair. As I think about it from my own classroom management style, that's probably not fair because the person does have maybe a bad track record, but what they say should be valid, right? And that's probably something I could get better at. As a country, they needed to get better at it. And to Jackson's credit, he was like, doesn't matter if you're landholding. Now, some of you might say, well, that's why he lost in 1824 because he just didn't have enough people to vote. So in 1828, he was skeptically doing it to get winners. That's probably true. But I guess in principle, he also set a stage of whether you're a landholder or not, you should be able to vote. So cool, yay democracy. But not blacks at this time. Especially Jackson was not going to let that happen. Okay, so this then gets into, there's a couple things I want you to know, but I won't have you write down. All right, let's get to our fifth and final thing you're going to write down in this section now, is under Jackson, he started the spoils system. You can put that in quotes. He started the spoils system in which the president fires all of the old staff and hires a completely new one. He fires all the old staff and hires a completely new one. In parentheses, you can put, usually his staff are going to be friends. Usually his staff are going to be friends. Okay, so what does that mean beyond that? The spoils system. The spoils system is interesting in the sense that prior to this, there was this idea because parties weren't really liked upon from George Washington, that from transition from president to president, we even had cabinet members sometimes who would stay over from president to president. But more importantly, cabinet level agencies, state level agencies, even to this day, have very much a lot of hangover. If you're in the bureaucracy, you're going to be there 30 plus years, usually, even if presidents change, usually. Cabinet members might change, they probably will change, but all the people who work under them in state level agencies will be the same. And before this, there were staff, and if you want to think of it like an onion layered effect, you have the staff of the president, you have cabinet level agencies, then you have independent regulatory agencies. That's what will really make up the bureaucracy. You won't find them in the legislative or in the executive branch. They're helping both out, in a way, the fourth unofficial branch of the U.S. government. So for the presidency, prior to Andrew Jackson, the staff was still held over, if that makes sense. Like staff that would come from Quincy Adams would stay over with Jackson. Not the case with Jackson. Jackson said, "Get out, I'm firing you." And many people said, "This is the spoil system. You're doing the spoil system where you're firing all the people and giving to the spoils of war go to the victor," hence that term spoil system. So if you support me, then I'll have you be my chief of staff. That's the first time it happened and still sticks to this day. Usually the person who runs his or her campaign, if they win the presidency, gets to have a staff level job. That's pretty shady. Yay, Jackson. But he's a people's president. He was a general and all that stuff, so he had the gathering from that and the credibility, I guess, as a leader, even though most generals have not had success as presidents. Being the commander-in-chief, yes, but also our founders did want a commander-in-chief who was a civilian, I suppose. So the whole battle at the end of War of 1812 for him, which he won, but it was already over. And anyway, all of that stuff showed he had some background. Now, those are the five things, not four. 5 that you had to write down for a big block of cheese. On top of that, there's something I just want you to know. I don't think you need to write it down or at all. He had a standing rule in the front office of the White House, if you will, as the foyer as you entered into it. He literally had a big block of cheese. Talk about government cheese. Ba-dum-bum. Literally, as you walked in the White House, is a freaking huge big block of cheese. Why? And I wish I could answer or at least have people answer to get points, but the points are suspended for this 2-week cycle as well. It's because he is the Democratic president wanted to be like, I'm the people's president. Here's free handouts. Here's food. And so they came in like, this was good cheese. And it just stayed there and smelled and got moldy and bad. Yay, democracy, I guess. So that's why it's called Big Block of Cheese. It shows like that was a physical manifestation of his like yay for the people. All right. That's that section on Big Block of Cheese. Now the next section is going to be Trail of Tears. In this section, there's 3 things that you want to write down about. This is hard. This is very hard constitutionally. This is getting into grounds like literally my first day at law school, we covered a case, Worcester versus Georgia. That was like vomitrocious. Not the case was awesome, and I applaud. This is in 1832, and the United States correctly ruled in the Supreme Court. This is where we get to see, unfortunately, Andrew Jackson's true feelings. So 3 things you're going to write down here in Trail of Tears. First is, when the settlers first came to America, most people thought of the Indians as noble savages. All right. So when the settlers first came to America, most people thought of the Indians as noble savages. I mean, it's good and bad, right? Because we think of them as noble, but they're savages. There's an importance in that. In literature and in documentation, newspapers and stuff, people would refer to them as noble savages. They still recognize their uniqueness, abilities within their own tribes and the different nations of American Indians, Native Americans. And they were recognized as such. But also savages, right? There's this in between. And coming from an Industrial Revolution background, or at least Age of Enlightenment background, it's easy to condemn those in potential loincloths or having, to them, rudimentary technologies, even though they actually had some pretty advanced irrigation practices, especially in the Midwest. But on surface value, they would say noble savages. It's not great, but it's a mixed bag. The second thing you're going to write down here is under Jackson, most Americans thought of the Indians as just savages. They just thought of the Indians as just savages under Jackson. It's a symbolic thing. If you look at literature then, it wasn't like Jackson instructed everybody to write in their papers that they're just savages. That's not what happened. But there's a shift that he maybe represented, he incited, he encouraged, that they were just savages. They were in the way. Well, I don't want to say they're in the way. They're savages. There's the nobility of what we can learn, especially with the advent, steamships, all the stuff, the power of steam, industrial revolution that we'll get to more with later on. But you start to see advents of things happening here, and with this idea of a little more steam power. I don't want to say industrial revolution yet. People very much then that disparity between the Native American tribes and what not settlers, but not colonists, but Americans, was getting bigger, and perceptively that was a big thing that you'd see that they call it just savages. The final thing we'll write down in this section on the Trail of Tears is with constant battles from, in their words, the white man, right? In constant battles from the white man, most Indian tribes were divided and desperate. Most Indian tribes were divided and desperate. A lot of what we have here is from a good professor at Weber State named Ryan Waite. And he doesn't pull any punches on Jackson, but he does say that it's not just Jackson creating all these battles, but they were divided and desperate, right? And in desperation, it's the mother of all invention, or necessity is the mother of all invention. Desperation is the mother of bad negotiations. Maybe that's how it is. Like if you're desperate to get a car and you'll just pay whatever, right? Because you don't have time, or you think you don't have options, or you think you don't have any other way, and you feel like a gun's being held to your head. In the Cherokee Nation and a couple other nations, they literally had guns held to their head. So negotiating practices were a little funky at best. Okay, before we get to the Worcester versus Georgia and we call that the Trail of Tears, and we'll get to more of that later on, but this is the start of it. Like you see the Trail of Tears happening in the sense of the heartbreak and the dissensions happening within the Cherokee nations, the Creek nations, Choctaw nations, Chickasaw nations, the ones that were basically in the eastern United States. You start to see this happening. Okay, in our last section for today, under Black Hawk War, there's a total of 5 things to write down. Shorter sentences. So we're setting a stage here. So you've got these dissensions on the East Coast, and you have the Louisiana Purchase area, if you will, Illinois specifically, the Fighting Illini, like University of Illinois. That's one of their mascots is the Fighting Illini. Like you have those tribes in the Midwest. You have the East Coast getting sort of separated, dissension, desperate because of a lot of territorial disputes with the white man. Meaning more so the United States government in general. In the Midwest, you also have a lot of issues here with their own wars. So, and I love that they call it a war here. Be aware that it's called a war, not really a war. Historians now agree it's not a war. The first thing under Black Hawk War is in Illinois, the Fox tribe was forced to sign away their lands by gunpoint. Basically, in Illinois, the Fox tribe was forced to sign away their lands. That's FOX. Okay, so they were forced to sign away their lands. Okay, they left their lands, and people who were not there at the negotiations, who then found out later were exiled out of our lands. We were forced to sign them away in a hasty negotiation. That doesn't sound right. They got upset. So the second thing you'll write down here is a tribal leader named Black Hawk led a group of about 750 peaceful members of their tribe, led a group of about 750 peaceful members of their tribe back to their lands again. So a tribal leader named Black Hawk led a group of about 750 peaceful members of their tribe back to their lands again. So they had been shifted out. They did sign. They did. But the negotiation was at best under duress. And so the treaty was signed. They left their lands. Black Hawk, who was one of the local chieftains, said, I don't like this deal at all. I wasn't there. This is a bad deal. We're going to do basically a peaceful sit-in. Okay, these were peaceful. They were not armed. They weren't pushing anybody out. They went back to their lands. This is where things get bad. Third thing is Jackson ordered about 1,500 federal troops. Jackson ordered about 1,500 federal troops to push them out. No, they got to get off. And you can see it in the U.S. government. This would be deemed what's called a squatter. You're sitting as a squatter. And we're going to get them off the land. So there is a legal backing for them to do that. But this is where things get even more desperate and broken down and potentially leading to a more literal trail of tears. And that is the fourth thing you'll write down is disappointed. Black Hawk and his 750 brethren exited the lands, specifically Illinois. They exited Illinois. So Black Hawk, disappointed. The federal troops came, disappointed, like, okay, all right, I mean, you guys are pushing us out. We wanted to make a statement that we felt like the deal wasn't good. We're leaving. And now their backs are turned, they're leaving. This isn't some big fight or war and battle going on, and then the Black Hawk, members of the Fox tribe, fail and leave. And no, it's just, oh, they're here, the jig is up. All right, they didn't get the message totally, but we're being forced out of our lands, we're leaving. The final thing you're going to write down here in the Black Hawk War. After the Indians exited Illinois, Jackson ordered these troops to kill all of them. Only two survived. After they had exited Illinois, their backs were there. Talking about a dishonorable death. Or dishonorable fight, sucker punch, whatever. President Jackson ordered all of them to be killed. Only two survived. This is really bad. You're seeing dissensions already within the eastern territories, and then you go to the Louisiana, the Midwest, the areas, and in those territories, specifically Illinois, you see a massacre. This is a massacre. And we had like the Bear River massacre, things like that. They're local. Oh man, this is not a war. This is not the Black Hawk War. This is the massacre. And Chicago Blackhawks, like if that is a reminder, I mean, I'm not saying like, yeah, they got a name of a team or whatever. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying if you're needing a reminder of Illinois, what happened? Oh, the Chicago Blackhawks, successful hockey team in the National Hockey League. Also suspended right now as a league. So in general, we've covered a lot. We've covered in the big block of cheese. We have that Jackson wins. We have that he invites everybody. The White House is trash. He's the Democratic president. All white men are allowed to vote because it's a trend happening. Jackson doesn't order it, but all the states start allowing, like even if you're non-land holding and land is more sparse, so people don't have land to sit on, and you are a tenant or whatever, you can still vote if you're a male and white. Spoil system was started. Trail of Tears, noble savages, then turned to savages, and a lot of dissension and desperation within the people of the different Indian nations, American Indian. And to be clear, American Indian and Native American depends on the tribe of what they want. So that just is a moniker. And in the Black Hawk War, man, 750 went back after they were sort of bamboozled from lands as a peaceful protest. The federal troops ordered them out. Jackson said, make him an example and kill him. Every president has a bad turn of events because, heck, as a debate coach, I've got bad things where I want to get things done and I move too fast or whatever. He has a number of incidents here, as you'll see even more next upload, and the other one, that's like, wow, he's really on the $20 bill, yikes. So there's that. I hope that helps. I promised my wife I would not say anything funny at the end of this, or some weird tagline of hitting the like or subscribe or pushing that notification button. I won't. I'm tempted to do an unboxing just because it's a YouTube upload and I feel like I have to, but I won't. Anyway, I hope you all are doing well, and I hope this helps. And that's part 1 of for U.S. History B on A House Divided. Okay, thanks.